Thank you very much for joining us. The Chamber of Commerce, we have joined up with the Guernsey Bereavement Service to put on this webinar to share information on how you need to accommodate people within your workplace and who are grieving. I'm going to hand over to Bill, who's going to be running through his presentation. Please bear with us if technology is a problem. But I will hand over to Bill, get going.
Well, thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for joining me here. We're going to be talking about grief in the workplace today. My name is Dr. Bill Webster. I am a grief counselor, a grief therapist. I'm an author. I have done several things in grief counseling over the last 35 years. And there are some people who really sometimes think of me as something of an expert. But what's an expert? An expert is someone who's more than 100 miles away from home. And I'm more than 100 miles away from home. I live in Canada, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here in Guernsey and to be doing some work with the Guernsey Bereavement Services. And we had a wonderful trip around the island yesterday, and it's just absolutely super. And thank you very, very much for inviting me. I have all kinds of credentials in grief and grief support. But really, I came to my work through some very personal losses. My wife, a young wife, died very suddenly in 1983, leaving me to be the single father of two young boys who at the time were 9 and 7. And so that really turned my life upside down. And I struggled to come to terms with that loss and to try to find ways to move on, which I did. And so part of that was in going to University of Toronto, doing my doctorate, and developing a career in grief support. And I've pioneered a number of local community services in grief support, and I'm also helping here in Guernsey with the bereavement services, people who I hold in high respect. And then 5 years ago, after 30 years as a so-called expert, my own son died very suddenly and unexpectedly in an accident. He was only 42 years of age. And again, my world was turned upside down. So I'm not just here as an academic. I'm here as someone who's experienced loss and who understands it from a personal experience and has tried to apply some of the principles that I've learned into my own life. So today we're going to talk a little bit about grief in the workplace. To say that our world has changed since COVID started in 2020, really that would probably be the underestimation of the century, wouldn't it? Because everything was turned upside down. I was hearing a little bit of how well Guernsey coped with COVID, and I was really, really impressed and so on. But many places in the world, the UK and Canada and all over the world, people have been very, very seriously affected. During the COVID pandemic, each and every one of us suffered a loss. For some, it was the loss of loved ones to death, or the loss of colleagues and friends. For others, it was the loss of the routine and the familiar, the loss of the opportunity to visit elderly people in nursing homes. For others, it was just the social distancing that meant we couldn't meet up with friends or go for coffee or go to the theatre or all of these things, the cancelled vacations, the postponed weddings and the postponed funerals, that people couldn't go and have a meaningful goodbye for their loved ones. Even not being able to go into the office every day and having to pivot to working at home and these kinds of things. All of these things transformed our lives. I think just very briefly, if we were to say a little bit about grief in the workplace, its causes, its repercussions and its solutions. Because I think if the last 3 years have taught us anything, it's really that employees, people, crave investment in the human aspects of their work. Employees are tired and they're grieving. They want a renewed and revised sense of meaning and purpose in their life. Grief never occurs in a vacuum. I think there are a number of aspects. It's physical, it's emotional, it's psychological, but it's also social. And just missing these kinds of opportunities to get together has been very, very difficult for people. It's also financial, and many people suffered financially as a result of the pandemic. So people need interpersonal relationships and connections with colleagues, with their managers, and so on. They want to have a sense of shared identity. Yes, of course, they want pay benefits and perks and all these kinds of things, but I think they want to feel valued in the workplace. Now, by not understanding what employees are running from and what they might gravitate to, I think companies really risk putting their businesses at risk. Moreover, because some employers are handling the situation similarly, failing perhaps to invest in fulfilling employee experience, failing to meet new demands for autonomy, flexibility at work, some really choosing to withdraw from traditional forms of full-time employment. So I believe that employees who have experienced a significant loss may not express their feelings verbally. And that results in things like inability to concentrate, a lack of energy, fatigue, lack of sleep, indecisiveness, disorientation, short-temperedness, and a range of emotions that might include anger and really intense sadness. So all that to say that people in the workplace suffer from loss. So let's think about what is loss. Loss occurs when you are deprived of something or someone that was of value to you. And in the workplace, many people have experienced loss through some of the things that I've talked about. And because of their lack of concentration, because of their emotional upset, they've also lost their own feelings of adequacy and efficiency and all these kinds of things. Now, anytime we experience a loss, we experience grief. And what is grief? Well, here's a little definition that I would like to offer. Grief is the feelings of harm, distress, deprivation, and sorrow that can result after losing someone or something that you cared about, something that was of value to you, or something that was important to you. Grief is a reaction to loss, in other words. Now, let's make this important distinction. Death is not the only loss that leads to grief. In the workplace, for example, it can be a loss by the death of someone that we care about, sure. But it can also be someone who has a life-threatening illness. It can also be someone who has lost their job or someone who has lost financial security. In fact, what I thought we might do, I was going to think of an open discussion, but just think for a moment, and maybe we can respond to some of these things in the questions. Let me ask you this question. What are some of the losses that might lead to grief in the workplace? I've suggested a few. Death, distress, disaster, financial insecurity, resignation, retirement. Write down a few that you can think of, and then maybe we'll come back and discuss that in the end. I'm going to give you 60 seconds. Just write something down and see what you can think of that might affect people in the workplace. All right. Well, I'll be very interested to hear some of the ideas that you have. I've been invited here to talk about grief in the workplace. So it's more about grief than it is about the workplace. But I think grief is a universal experience. And so I'm sure there'll be a real application for those of you who are in the workplace, whether as employers or as employees. So let's begin to think about grief. What is grief? Let me say, first of all, there is no one neat, orderly way to describe the grief process. Oh, there are many theories. We all go back to Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And that's very valuable. But there are many other systems. Everyone who's written a book, myself included, comes up with a system. This is how grief works. But here's what I'd like to say to you. There is no one neat, linear system. There's no one time frame. Everybody is unique. Everybody's different. So each person is going to react in a different way. Now, here's another statement that I think is important. That the problem is that people may not experience grief in a predictable, neat, orderly, linear structure, but we need to understand it in some organized paradigm. In other words, if we're going to help people deal with their grief, we have to have some kind of a strategy, some kind of way to look at it, to understand it, to express it, and to empower people to work their way through it. So let's think about grief, but let me make an important distinction first of all. Let's distinguish between grief and mourning. Now, we kind of use these words almost interactively, don't we? Someone's grieving, they're mourning, and really they're both the same, right? Well, let me make a distinction. Let me first of all ask you to look at what grief is. Here's another definition of grief. Grief is an inward emotional reaction to any experience of loss, involving a sequence of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors based upon their unique perception of the loss. That's important. It's their perception, it's how they see the loss. In other words, to put it in very simple terms, here's a much simpler definition. Grief is how we feel after a loss. Someone dies, someone gets a life-threatening diagnosis, someone loses their job. How do they feel about that? In other words, grief is an internal process. Now, we need to remember that. But let's think about mourning. Mourning is different. Mourning is how we outwardly express our feelings after any loss. And maybe you'll see a little bit of the distinction. Grief is how we feel. Mourning is how we express those feelings. But unfortunately, that's where the disconnect comes up. Because think about it. We hear of someone who's had a loss. They're grieving. They're depressed. They're down. They're weepy. They're sad. They feel like their world has been turned upside down. And then someone says to them, "And how are you doing?" And they say, "Oh, I'm fine." So we grieve, but we often don't mourn. We don't express those feelings. And so, as we'll see in the next slide, there is this disconnect between grief and mourning. We feel one thing, but we say we're fine because we don't know how to express it. We don't know what to say. So let me give you a new paradigm, a new perspective on the grief response. A paradigm on the effects of any loss on any individual or workplace environment. This is not just about death, it's about loss, whatever that loss is. So let's see what the first principle is. The first principle is this, that we do not see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. When life is good, when things are going well, when you're having some success, it's not unusual to hear people say, "Isn't it a wonderful world? Boy, I gotta tell you, everything's so great. I'm on top of the world." But talk to someone who's had a loss. Talk to someone whose loved one has died or who's just received a life-threatening diagnosis, someone who's just lost their job. They might say, you know what? It can be a pretty cruel and unkind world. So the question is, which is it? Is it a wonderful world, or is it a cruel and unkind world? And the answer is, we do not see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. We can't assume to know how someone else feels about what they're going through, because their world is different. Their world has changed. In fact, I think it's important to say that the key to understanding bereavement is recognizing that the bereaved person's world has been changed forever. Which leads us to say that we serve people better if we focus on the significance of this bereavement rather than on the substance of their specific reaction to the bereavement. Now, let me just break these two words down. We're going to think about the significance and the substance. But remember, it's all in the context of recognizing that this person feels like their world has changed forever. And again, think about, how did the world change during COVID? Think about, how does your world change when you lose a parent, a child, a spouse, a sibling, a family member, a friend? You see, ladies and gentlemen, there's no way that we can say that any loss is more or less difficult. It's just different. Every loss is difficult for the person who is experiencing it because their world has changed. So often people say, well, is it worse to lose a spouse? Is it worse to lose a child? Is it worse to have someone die suddenly and unexpectedly, or to die after a long lingering illness? The only answer is that the worst kind of loss is yours. So for that individual, that employee, for them, their world has changed and it feels like the worst thing they can be going through. So let's think about the significance and the substance. After a significant loss, we re-enter the world of work, struggling to combine two types of role. Our work role, which remains the same, and our role as grievers, whose whole world has changed forever. So let's go to the next slide and just say, hey, unfortunately, these two roles are often found to be incompatible, and guess which role suffers more? That's all right. We're good. We're good. So let's just have some pointers on employee well-being. What do we do in the workplace to support a grieving person who's had a significant loss? The government some years ago in the UK introduced bereavement leave. We've all heard of people getting maternity leave. You know, I don't know what it is in here. Yeah. And so 9 months or a year, and you can understand because, new moms have a lot of work to do. They're looking after the baby day and night. What would a grieving person do with 9 months off or a year off? In fact, there would be some ways of saying that might not be a constructive thing, because sometimes getting back into a routine structure is a remedy for chaos. And when your world has been turned upside down, it can be chaotic. It feels chaotic, and sometimes it is chaotic. And so I think in wisdom, often companies will give a person so many days of bereavement leave, not necessarily consecutively, but throughout perhaps the next 6 months or whatever, that when they're just going through a difficult time, something has triggered a reaction, that they can have some time off and some compassion and so on. I think it's very important. I've actually left a sheet with my colleagues here at the Chamber of Commerce, and you'll be receiving that on some tips as to employee well-being for the employee and one for the employer. So I hope that will be helpful. So the significance and the substance. Let's go back to that aspect. All right. I think we need to remember that in terms of the significance, that This is an important principle in support and indeed in counseling. And it's this, that there is a reason for every reaction. So often we look at people's behaviors. In fact, sometimes people look at the substance and that's all they look at. Oh, look, they're crying, they're emotional. They're not able to concentrate on their work. They're forgetful, they're disoriented. And that's a very serious thing in the workplace. But there's a reason for every reaction. So often we say, okay, they're crying, they're emotional. What can we do to fix it? But really, the substance, what you see on the outside is really only the symptoms of what's really going on. What's the reason behind the reaction? Because the reality is that every single behavior makes sense to the person who's doing it. Sometimes people ask, why is my child being disobedient? Why don't they do what they're told? Why are they not paying attention? And sometimes you find the reason behind the reaction is that children would rather be punished than be ignored. And so somehow the behavior makes sense to the person, and getting underneath it to recognize the significance of the behavior is more important. But what does the experience of grief look like? This is the substance that we're talking about. So let's go quickly through these. The first reaction that people often have is termed avoidance. Kubler-Ross would call it denial, and that's okay. That's a great term. But let's just go quickly through some of the emotions that you may see in a grieving person in the early days after a loss. The first and the second are numbness and shock, because it's just unbelievable. I can't believe that this has happened. My whole world's been changed. My whole world's been turned upside down. Is this really happening? Is this a bad dream? Am I going to waken up and find that this is a nightmare? Now, here's the difficulty. Some people confuse numbness with strength. Think about how many times you've gone to a funeral and people seem to be doing remarkably well. They don't seem to be emotional. And we say to them, oh, you're doing so well. My goodness, you're so strong. In fact, well, they are strong because they're standing on their feet at a time when their world's been changed. But in fact, they're numb, they're in shock. And this is the body's defense mechanism that protects them from the full impact of what has happened. So some of the manifestations here, we'll just go quickly through these. Confusion. We can't just figure things out. Our mind doesn't seem to be able to concentrate on anything else other than the loss. Now, obviously, in the workplace, this is a very serious thing, especially those who are working in dangerous environments where concentration is very important. One is forgetfulness, forgetting appointments, forgetting what I'm supposed to do. Their mind is elsewhere. They are disoriented. And disorientation means they feel lost. You may say, well, is that really a kind thing to say? The word lost actually means in the wrong place. They feel like they're in the wrong place. This isn't the familiar place. This isn't the world I've been used to. This is a different world, a new world. And so helping people to find their way through the fog, if you like. So what's the reason behind these reactions? I believe it's people trying to accept what's unacceptable and believe what's unbelievable and come to terms with something that just seems overwhelming. Another result then is fatigue and often apathy. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross called it denial, and that is a good concept. I have no problem with the concept of denial. But really, I think it's important to recognize that what's going on here is a natural reaction to a human loss. So as we move on, sorry, I bumped the computer there. My boys used to say the way to keep me quiet is to tie my hands together because I like to be fairly active. So denial, and then that sense of unreality that we may have. It just doesn't seem real. And then maybe a month or two later, the pendulum swings from numbness to oversensitivity. And I'm going to go quickly through this, but let's just look at some of the reactions that people can have. This could be, remember, there's no one neat, orderly way. There's no time frame here. But often what you find after a while is if they go from numbness to hypersensitivity. Everything touches them on the raw nerve. Little things, not things that they would normally take in stride, suddenly become like Herculean labors. And so people overreact. Things, again, that they would normally take in stride, everything is a big deal. They struggle with anxiety and fear and vulnerability. And these three emotions are all tied in together. Anxiety is rooted by fear. And there's only really one basic phobia, and that is the fear of not being able to control things. So when your world is turned over, when your world changes, if this can happen, what else can happen? And so people translate fear into vulnerability. They're just kind of expecting the next shoe to fall, as it were. And again, in the workplace, that can be very distracting and indeed dangerous. So you'll find that people can be irritable. They struggle with guilt and blame. You know, they feel maybe I could have done something to prevent this, or maybe I should have done something different. And blaming other people. Well, if it wasn't for that, employer of mine or whatever, and because guilt and blame again are rooted in a sense of powerlessness. What could I have done, or what could you have done? And in a sense, it's useless because, we can't change what has happened. But people would prefer to feel that they have some sense of control. I could have done something, gives them a sense of control, even though, ladies and gentlemen, it's often an illusion of control. So anger is another emotion that we see often. And every angry person, you think about it, every angry person has been disenfranchised. They've lost control over something. So people's anger over COVID, because there was nothing we could do. Or people's anger over a death, or the loss of a job, a dismissal, or compulsory retirement, or whatever it happens to be, anger. So what the person does is they yearn and they search. They try to find ways to get it back. What they want, grieving people only want one thing. They want their old world back. And so the yearning, the longing that we see, and then the searching, what can I do? How can I get back to the way things were? So these emotions describe the substance. But really, we need to focus on these things and understand them. But it's the significance that we really need to think about. So let's move on to the significance. And really, what we're asking is this. What does the experience of grief mean to any individual or group of people? What does it mean to people in the workplace when a colleague dies? What does it mean when something happens in the business and they're now on part-time, or they're laid off, or forced retirement, or whatever? And I think we really need to tackle this by saying, well, what is it that people lose after a loss? So let's move into that aspect. Okay. There are many different losses that occur as a result of an event. So as we go to the next slide, we'll see that there are actually many kinds of loss. There's a primary loss. Now, a primary loss can be any loss. It can be a death, an illness, a layoff, retirement. Any loss is a primary loss, but as a result of the primary loss, there are often secondary losses. For example, someone loses their job. That's the primary loss. But as a result, well, What about financial security? How are the kids going to be able to, go to the soccer or take the ballet lessons or whatever? There are many secondary losses that occur as a result of the primary loss. Some people may lose their home. Some people may have to move. So there's physical loss, tangible things, but in addition to that, there's also symbolic loss. The loss of my hopes and dreams, the loss of the concept that I would live happily ever after, the symbolic loss of reliability. It's what I call in one of my books, the grief of unmet expectations. This isn't what I expected. This isn't the way I thought things were going to be. And so we often struggle with some of these secondary or subsequent losses, physical and symbolic, which brings us back to the question, what has been lost? And I just like to briefly give you a few suggestions. So some of the pieces of the jigsaw that come. Have you gone back? No, just keep going ahead. That's it. Yeah, you just move forward. That's great. Thanks. That's all. My friend is doing such a wonderful job here, and we're on different computers, and technology is great when it works, isn't it? But we're having a great time here, and I hope that you're getting a lot out of the out of it as well. So I think we need to move a bit forward. I think we've jumped a bit. There we are. That's it. Now we're talking. Good stuff. Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. So what I'm going to suggest is that life is like a jigsaw puzzle made up of many pieces. And if you think about it, when someone dies or we have any loss, we actually lose many pieces of our lives when someone we love suffers a significant loss. Many pieces, and we've seen some of these in effect. For example, some of the pieces of the jigsaw, the loss of identity. Who am I now? Am I changed? Am I different? Do I see myself differently because I'm no longer working, or because this loved one has died, or because I have a life-threatening illness? The loss of attachment. I think this is much more significant than we realize through COVID, because in many places people were socially isolated, especially elderly people. We didn't see our work colleagues. And I really do believe that the physical presence of people adds to our psychological well-being. Another loss, the loss of territory, the loss of a place, the loss of our familiar space in the world or in our own lives. Again, the loss of financial security. I mean, these things are obvious, but I think that often we feel them, but we don't express them. So, yeah, the loss of financial security. And many people did suffer during the COVID time. But many people suffered because of unemployment or loss of work or retirement or whatever. And again, the loss of structure. Structure is very important in our lives. Structure helps us deal with chaos. And when we don't have a structure in our lives, getting up every morning. So during COVID, I worked at home, but I got up every morning at the same time. I showered, I got dressed, and I got to my office. And just that structure, simple things, having breakfast and so on. I often, when people who are not used to work at home, they sit around with an extra cup of coffee, they read the newspaper, and around 10 or 11 o'clock, well, I guess it's better. And it's structure is very important. I'm not saying rigid structure, but having a structure in your life is very important. Let's move on. There are other losses here. Okay, great. The loss of expectations. This isn't what I expected. This isn't the way I thought life was going to be. I call it the loss of the script, because we all have a script for our lives. And when someone dies, well, this isn't according to the script, and we struggle with that. The loss of the future. I had thought that we would do this. I thought that I would retire and we would travel, but now because of this illness, because someone has died, we're not going to be able to fulfill that future. Or the loss of a child, and we expected that child would be with us forever and look after us in our old age. And when that child dies, the loss of that future, the loss of purpose, the loss of having a reason to get up in the morning. And finally, of course, the loss of meaning, because we often do interpret ourselves according to what we do and how we are. So what are some of the needs behind these losses? Let me take them one by one again. The needs behind the losses. The loss of identity represents the need to be known, to be recognized, to be acknowledged as a human being. The loss of attachment really talks about the need to be included. And I think all of us suffered socially in that sense. People missed having, the coffee break with workmates or with lunch or whatever. And that need to be social is very important. The loss of territory really means the need to belong. This is my place. This is where I belong. Again, moving on, the loss of finances, the need for security in finances, the need for, that, well, we were expecting these kinds of things. We were going to get the mortgage paid off and we were going to send our kids to university and all of these financial things that bring security. The need for structure, because structure enables us to experience stability. And there's a great deal of satisfaction, but a great deal of peace in stability. And then finally, the loss of expectations, the need to, or the desire to follow the script. So let's just kind of wrap these up and to say the loss of the future is the need for some direction. So now what? Where am I going? What's the rest of my life going to look like? The loss of purpose, the need to feel important, that my life is significant, that I'm here to make a contribution. I'm doing something worthwhile. And of course, then the loss of significance is the need to find meaning. It's interesting. Kubler-Ross wrote her book in 1969 on denial and the 5 stages. And just recently, one of her students has added a 6th phase, and it's the phase of meaning. Because we all like to think that our life is going to be meaningful. I mean, we may not be able to make sense of some of the difficult circumstances of life, but we want to feel that life has gone according to plan, that my life is meaningful. I've made a contribution. It may not be perfect, but I've made some kind of a contribution to society and so on. So grief, as we've seen then, and I like this definition, grief is a natural adaptive reaction. Grief is what enables us to come to terms with a new reality, to adapt to a new situation, to a new world, if you wish. And I've added to that simple definition, a natural adaptive reaction, by saying it's a painful but necessary mental recalibration to accommodate a new absence. What we're saying is we've all had significant losses during COVID over the course of our working career, and it's painful when it changes. And we have to make that necessary mental recalibration to accommodate a new absence, something that's now missing, or indeed something that has changed. And so I think we begin to rebuild when we do 4 things. Number 1, we recognize that life is different. We have to recognize that. Life has changed. The world has changed. My world has changed. We then have to redefine who I am now. How can I recalibrate my life to say, okay, I'm in a different situation, a new world. Who am I now? And where's my place in that world? To reinterpret life as it now is. It's different, but that doesn't mean to say it can't be good. And how can I reinterpret my life and say, yeah, well, okay, yes, I missed this and I missed that, but I've still got this and I've still got that. I can find ways to make the most of it. And I think we really begin to rebuild our lives when we choose resilience over resignation. So in my mind, there are 4 things that are necessary in elements of aftercare, and especially in the workplace. The first is education. We need to understand what's normal. And I think some of the programs that the Chamber offers and bereavement services offer right here in this community offer that kind of information. You see, many grieving people don't understand what's happening. Oh, I'm confused. Oh, I can't concentrate. What's going wrong? I'm going crazy. This is a mental health illness. They need to understand that grief is a natural human reaction to any event of loss. Once they understand that this is normal, now we need to normalize but not minimize. Just because it's normal doesn't mean to say it isn't difficult. But once we understand that this is normal, then we're able to move into empathy, which is sharing with one another, to sort of be able to sympathize with someone and say, hey, you're going through a difficult time. This isn't something unusual or something pathological. This is a natural progress. Empathy means being able to understand a person. It's not just saying, I know how you feel. It's expressing how you feel and them saying, yes, I know you understand. That's what empathy is. The third stage, though, is expression, the opportunity to talk about it. And maybe in the workplace, you can organize, a little support group that maybe during a lunch break or something, people who want to can come around and chat about it and talk about what they're going through. I know the bereavement resources and the Chamber can offer you some of these resources in the workplace to offer to employees. And then the fourth element of aftercare is always empowerment. Okay, because I think it's very important to recognize that healing doesn't mean the loss hasn't occurred. It simply means that the loss doesn't control us any longer. I say that again. Healing doesn't mean that the loss hasn't occurred. It simply means that it no longer controls us. And that really is the purpose of grief support. So let's go to the next slide and we'll just say this. We could discuss, and maybe you can ask questions, what could a company or business do to help support someone after a significant loss? And I'm going to leave a sheet with my friend here at the Chamber, and she will make sure that you receive that. There's a sheet of help for employers and also some tips for those who are going through the struggle themselves. And I think that will work well. So let's then just see if we can wrap that up. And as I say, rather than going through it, I'd like to leave some time for questions. But we're going to be offering you some recommendations for health and wellness leaders, management, and fellow employees. Here's an important statement. Simon Sinek is a big guru in the world and the business world these days. And he made this statement. I think it applies in all areas of business. I think it also applies to people who are doing support and grief work. A leader's job is not to do the work for others. It's how to help others figure out how to do it themselves, to get things done and to succeed beyond what they thought possible. And that's really what we've been all about here today. So I think we'll leave it at that, actually, and we'll just take some questions and so on. And I'd be interested to hear if anyone has any responses or reactions.
Thanks, Bill. That was really interesting and really, really useful. I've not actually got any questions posted in the group at the moment. If you've got questions and you don't want to ask them and have them answered on the webinar, please do feel free to send them through and we'll happily share them with Bill after the event. So I guess at this point, if there aren't any more questions, do you want to go through some more?
I wanted to leave lots of time.
Yeah.
If you go down in the slides, you'll find strategies of help and communication. So I could maybe just take another 5 minutes. Yeah, just keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Good, good. Yeah, that's some of the things that are on the sheet actually. And so that's good. Yeah, here we are. This is the review.
Well, I've gone too far. Now I've gone too far. There we go.
All right. So how do we help a grieving person? Well, Edmund Burke, the great British philanthropist, made this important statement. Burke said, "Nobody made a greater mistake than they who did nothing because they could only do a little." So thank you for joining us on the workshop here. And you'll be saying, oh, well, we really need to get a grief counselor in. We really need to get a professional to do this. No. You can be a huge support to grieving people, just in simple ways. And I'd like to suggest some of these strategies to you now. Here's the first few. The first thing, the most important thing, is to be there. You say, well, that's obvious and stuff. Well, no, wait a minute. Let's go back. Grief is how we feel. Mourning is how we express it. How are you doing? I'm fine. Really? Be there. Not just the first day, not just the first week. Be there maybe a month down the road, maybe 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road. Be there on birthdays. Be there on special days and special occasions. I believe it's important to reach out and make contact as soon as possible, because someone who is in crisis wants help. They're desperately wanting help, and they're likely to grasp it at the first opportunity that comes along. So don't hesitate. Don't say, well, I'll wait a month or so and I'll be in touch. Because by then, is the word desperation too strong? Maybe it is. But in their anxiety, they might reach out for other resources that may not be as helpful. What we're trying to do in these early days is not to give them a lecture on grief support. It's not to sort of give them all the theories and, well, there are 5 stages of grief and all that kind of stuff. It's to restore a state of equilibrium. It's to calm things down, to restore a sense of balance in the person's life and in their mind and heart. And often the way we do that is to listen. We listen not just with our ears, we listen with our eyes, we listen with our facial expression. Because if someone's describing a horrendous situation, we go, the person's going to stop because they think they're upsetting you. So be very careful with your body language and listen. Here's what I like to say to my students. If you're talking more than the person, you're really not being as helpful as you think. So that's a very simplistic way of putting it. But listen, ask them open-ended questions. Tell me about the person. How did you meet? What were they like? What was special about them? What do you miss most about them? Listen as they tell their story. Every life tells a story. And people want to tell the story because they don't want their loved ones to be forgotten. So ask them about the person's life as well as about the person's death. Don't be curious. Don't ask them questions about, well, what happened? Because sometimes it's difficult. I found that question very difficult. After my son died 5 years ago, he died in an accident. And I felt that people were just being curious. They didn't really, they weren't expressing care and concern. They were expressing curiosity. They said, oh, did you hear about what happened to Bill's son? I didn't want that. I wasn't going to put up with that. So, just listen, talk about the life and so on. Make a specific offer of help. In other words, don't say, now, if there's anything I can do, don't hesitate to let me know, because people don't respond to that. First of all, they don't know what they need. And secondly, they're not really sure that they can impose on you. So say, how can I help? and think about it. What would this person in this situation with this world turned upside down need? And so be specific. Can I do this for you? Can I take you to your doctor's appointment? Can I help you? Someone has died and you've never learned to cook. Could I help you not just by taking food, by helping them to learn new skills and how they can handle it? How do you get your oil changed in the car? All these practical details. Be specific. And of course, let your care and concern show. I think that's very important. People need to know that. Interpret normal behavior. Now, I know the Bereavement Centre has many books and resources that can help you with that. And I encourage you to utilize that wonderful resource. But let people know that it's okay to grieve. They're not going crazy. They're not losing their mind. This is a natural, normal human reaction. And there's a reason for every reaction. But give them permission to grieve. Let them know it's okay. You can accept them as being wounded. They're hurt. Help them identify secondary losses. Because yes, a loved one has died, but boy, you must miss having someone to take you to dinner or go to a movie with, or you must miss this or that aspect about the relationship. Help them deal with unfinished business. I didn't have a chance to say goodbye. Or I wish I had, taken them here, there, or whatever. And help them to deal with some of these issues. Encourage the verbalization of feelings, the reliving of memories. Grieving people want to remember. Grief invites them to remember, not to forget. And we remember by talking about it. Anything that is mentionable is manageable. And so when people are saying, oh, I'm fine, and they're not sure how they can mourn, they don't feel like they're being given permission to grieve, well, that can be difficult. So encourage the verbalization. Tell me about it. And that can be helpful. Accept them unconditionally as wounded people. They're not going crazy, but they're hurt. They're wounded. So accept that. I know you're going through a tough time right now, but it's okay. I'm here for you. And I can accept that you're not quite yourself, and that's okay. You're here. I'm here. And let's work this out. Here's a hard one. You have to be realistic about the help you can offer. You can do many things to support a grieving person, but you can't do the one thing that they really, really want. And you know what that is? They want their loved one back. They want the situation returned to normal. They want to get back to they want to get back to their old world. And we can't fix it. Therefore, you have to be willing to tolerate angry responses. They're not angry at you. They're angry because they're in the situation, but so often people become the target. So just recognize yourself like a lightning rod. You're a lightning rod conducting this anger to a safer place where people can deal with it. Maintain a realistic perspective. Don't come in with cliches and it's all going to work out for the best and so on. People don't see that at the moment. Maybe it will, but they don't see it right now. So view the loss from the griever's unique perspective. So assist in the adjustments to life as it now is and find out what these are. What are they finding difficult adjustments? Is it in the home? Is it in the workplace? Is it in society? Be aware of difficult days throughout the process. It's not a linear process. It's not, 3 months and then you'll be over it. It comes and goes. Holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, just trigger days that can be difficult. And continue your support throughout the process. That might be months or longer. But don't just kind of stick around for a month and then abandon people because they don't want to do that. So we're just moving towards the end here. Maybe you're asking, but what if I make a mistake? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I open a can of worms? What if I mention the person and they start to cry? Have I made it worse? Well, the only mistake you can make is not mentioning it. Because as I said, people don't want their loved ones to be forgotten. But here's the really good news. Here's the really good news. Maya Angelou said this: people may not remember what you say or do, but they will remember how you made them feel. So in a sense, you can't say the wrong thing unless it's something really stupid, But I mean, say whatever, because they won't remember it. They will remember that you were there. You were there. And that's what will make them feel good. So trust yourself. And if you do make a mistake, own it and forgive yourself for being human. So last 2 slides. First of all, to say grief support involves a reinterpretation of how life can be meaningful even in the light of loss, by empowering people to redefine life as it now is and to find ways to make the most of what they still have left. But remember, here's the proviso. No one can persuade us to change. Each of us guards a gate of change that can only be opened from the inside. We cannot open the gate of another, only our own. So I want to thank the folks here, wonderful people at the Chamber of Commerce, and thank Elizabeth and Maura from the Bereavement Centre for having me here. And to just say it's been a privilege. I hope this has been helpful for you. And I don't know if there are any questions coming in. No questions. I've either answered all the questions or I've lost you completely. And I hope it's the former, that's for sure. So thank you ever so much. It's been a real privilege. And I hope our paths cross again. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.